Kia ora koutou, and thanks very much to Sam and the organisers for inviting me. Here's my structure. In 2014, Tony Ballantyne interpreted Māori missionary encounters before 1840 using entanglements of empire as an explanatory metaphor. Departing from what he called the blunt readings of Keith Sinclair, Judith Binney and Ranganui Walker, who portrayed missionaries as destroyers of Māori culture, Ballantyne argued that Māori Christian teachers and evangelists spread Christianity among their own people by creatively reworking their own religious and cultural traditions to make Christianity their own. Important work by Māori historians such as Monty Sutar and Hirini Ka have elaborated these points in Mihinare, Māori Anglican, contexts. Ballantyne intended the entanglements metaphor to illuminate the ways in which missionaries and Māori found themselves transformed by entering the world of the other. After 1840, however, the erosion of rangatiratanga by the colonial state and the demands of colonists for land and the full assertion of British sovereignty undercut the authority of missionaries intended to push Māori to the margins of the developing colonial society. Colonisation created deep lines of fracture within both Māori and colonial communities as thousands of settlers largely detached from Māori communities arrived. In this paper, I use Ballantyne's fertile entanglements metaphor to explore the divisions that emerged within as well as between Māori and settler communities between 1840 and 1872. The end of the most consequential hot phase of the New Zealand Wars. I do so by focusing firstly on two leaders of what contemporaries called the Philo Māori, or later the Church Party. George Selwyn, first and only Anglican Bishop of New Zealand, pictured here with his close friend William Martin, and CMS Missionary Octavius Hadfield, son-in-law of Henry Williams. Both were Oxbridge-educated, upper-middle-class, English clerical missionaries with close personal and family ties to the Anglican Establishment. Along with Selwyn's friend, Sir William Martin, these men, their wives, and a group of mostly Anglican supporters had an up-and-down career in New Zealand historiography. The following all-too-brief sketch argues that changing historical interpretations of these people tell us something about the historians and their contexts, as well as about their subjects. During their lifetimes, and especially during the war years, Selwyn and Hadfield attracted enormous attention in Parliament and the press in New Zealand, Australia, and Britain. Almost everybody had an opinion, often strong. George Rusden, William Pember Reeves, and our first generation of professional historians, Harrop, McClintock, Morell and Beaglehole, gave them significant roles in narratives portraying colonisation as largely inevitable and mostly benign. A second, more critical phase emerged during the 1950s and 60s when scholars such as Keith Sinclair, Bill Oliver, Keith Sorensen, Judith Binney and Alan Ward depicted colonisation as more damaging for Māori than previously acknowledged. Now the Anglican humanitarians inspired ambivalence as well as admiration. Sinclair, for example, claimed that missionary ideas were as destructive of Māori society as bullets. In a 1971 article, however, he also claimed that evangelical and humanitarian ideas got race relations off to a better start than in most other white settler colonies, a view that, as Philippa Wyatt has recently shown, he maintained to the end of his life. By the 1980s, in the wake of the Springbok tour and the land marches, a younger generation of left liberal historians sympathetic to Māori grievances and aspirations portrayed the missionaries and humanitarians more critically than ever. Kerry Howe argued that although Selwyn's circle did indeed criticise the Taranaki War, they backed the government during the invasion of the Waikato, determined to impose civilisation through the barrel of a gun. In his 1986 study of the New Zealand Wars, James Bellich claimed that previous historians constructed the national legend of exemplary race relations by exaggerating the influence of missionaries and humanitarians, who were scarcely less ethnocentric, if not racist, than other colonists. If they sometimes transcended one set of preconceptions, they normally fell victim to another. By 2003, Michael King's best-selling Penguin History of New Zealand, which relied heavily on Bellich and sold over 300,000 copies, last count, omitted Selwyn and Hadfield from the text entirely. The deep divisions, their defence of Māori land and political rights between 1840 and 1862 generated within settler culture began disappearing. Ironically, just as influential Pākehā historians were almost eliminating humanitarians, Māori historians working in and for the Waitangi Tribunal began rediscovering them. According to the Taranaki report, many Pākehā advocated a Māori point of view that held the government responsible for the war. Its main author, Eddie Dury, an Anglican, identified William Martin, Bishop Selwyn and Hadfield as the most prominent Pākehā critics. After Bill Oliver and Giselle Burns criticised the presentism of tribunal historiography, historians responded by paying more attention to Selwyn, Hadfield and others as contemporary voices that British and colonial governments might have heeded. As Grant Phillipson showed, the new tribunal historiography often portrayed Selwyn and Hadfield positively, though selectively, rather than in rounded and contextualised ways. Soon historians such as Michael Belgrave were producing notably sympathetic revisionist readings of the often maligned Henry Williams and his role in translating Te Tiriti, arguing that he aimed to preserve chiefly mana and rangatiratanga from British colonisers he mainly distrusted. Now, in what follows, I make 4 points. Against the recent tendency to depict the incoming culture as largely united, cohesive and homogeneous over racial politics, I emphasise firstly the depth and intensity of the conflicts dividing Anglican humanitarians and their critics between 1840 and 1872. Secondly, I argue that Ballantyne's entanglements metaphor is as illuminating for the quarter century after 1840 as before. Selwyn and Hadfield spoke out strongly on racial politics, partly because, entangled in Māori worlds, they took Māori concerns and perspectives seriously. These entanglements help to explain why settler attacks on them as religious fanatics favouring Māori at the expense of their fellow Britons should be taken seriously. They contained elements of truth. Thirdly, religion, politics and race were inextricably entangled during this period. Settler politicians during the wars elbowed aside or crushed those religious movements and groups that practiced what they considered the wrong kind of racial politics. The Christian politics of the kingitanga, the many Christian Māori who criticised government actions in Taranaki and the Waikato without going to war, as well as those who did, and the clerical missionary leaders of the colony's largest church. Ultimately, the colonial state decided what kind of religion and racial politics it would tolerate and embrace, and what kind it would reject. Fourthly, I argue, against the powerful secular nationalist historiographical tradition that's tended to cut us off from our old world religious past, that only by reconnecting colonial New Zealand with British and Irish history can we understand why colonial debates over religion, race and politics became so contentious. It's one of the tragic ironies of New Zealand history that Māori had the misfortune to be championed in the early colonial period, most vociferously, by the one group of Pākehā, Oxbridge-educated upper middle class Anglican clergy, most likely to alienate the many anti-clerical Anglicans, Protestant dissenters, Irish Catholics, secular liberals and freethinkers who did not want upper crust Anglican clerical missionaries running the show. Battles over racial politics were simultaneously contests over what sort of society was emerging and who would be in charge. Turning now to Hadfield and Selwyn, this section explores the ways in which their personalities, church and missionary visions, and relationships with Māori entangled them in Māori worlds in consequential ways. Hadfield first. Born at Bond Church in the Isle of Wight to a silk merchant and his wife, the daughter of an English general, Hadfield came from higher in the social scale than earlier missionaries. Growing up in Brussels, Lille, Paris and Tours, he learned to speak 6 languages, comfortable with linguistic and cultural difference. Strong-minded, he defied his father by joining the CMS. In January 1839, he became the first Anglican priest ordained in New Zealand. "I am a churchman, sent here by a bishop of the Church of Christ," he wrote his mother, determined to uphold church discipline and principles. His commitment to Anglican authority strengthened when, convalescing from serious illness in Wellington during the mid-1840s, he forged a friendship with Bishop Selwyn, who held higher views of the authority of the church and its bishops. In the UK, Hadfield believed, entanglement with and subordination to the state compromised and weakened the church's freedom and authority. He thought nothing more important for the healthy well-being of the body politic than for the church to exercise its moral authority and pastoral discipline for the common good. In 1850, he told Governor Grey that he wanted to make the Church of England a power in the new land. Selwyn, who arrived in 1842 while learning te reo Māori en route, also brought a lofty vision of the church. New Zealand offered a chance to follow the principle of justice for almost the first time in our colonial history. As Māori embraced Christianity and the civilised arts, Selwyn hoped they would take their place among the English settlers without distinction of person. It is such an opening as has never before been granted to the leaders of any new colony. During Hadfield's long illness, Selwyn ministered to his Ngāti Raukawa, Te Ateawa and Ngāti Toa Mihinare. This experience, noted Charles Abraham, left Selwyn deeply attached to his people. Young Christian chiefs launched Hadfield's missionary career in the southern North Island. Katu Te Raupraha and Martin and Octavius came to Waimate in 1839 to secure a missionary for their people. Keen to leave, Hadfield travelled to Ōtaki with Te Wiremu, who became his father-in-law. He arrived to find Ripahau, a Ngāti Raukawa ex-slave, had been teaching and preaching in the area since 1838. Senior Te Ateawa chief Rere Te Whangawhanga and his son, Wiremu Kingi, Taringa Take, pictured here, provided patronage, instruction and support. Over the following years, Hadfield baptised hundreds, including Kingi. Some, notably Riwai Te Ahu and Kingi Te Ahuahu of Te Ateawa, became trusted friends and colleagues. Soon after arriving, Octavius visited a hostile Ngāti Raukawa chief to dissuade him from disrupting services. Ignored, Hadfield bit a kumara, inadvertently breaking tapu. Te Matia, the chief, rushed over with a tomahawk. Only the intervention of his daughter and a chief's son, who covered Hadfield's head with their hands, saved his life. Here Iwi, the local tohunga, then cursed his rival. Hadfield's supporters, asking how he was going to survive, Hadfield coolly went about his business, ignoring the curse. That night, the tohunga dropped dead. Local people, impressed, concluded that Hadfield and his atua had triumphed. Although Hadfield believed that the tohunga died from a ruptured pulmonary artery, his mana soared. In December 1839, he moved into the Te Ateawa pā at Waitangi, living in a rush whare for the next 4 years. Younger chiefs such as Kingi and Te Ahu taught him te reo Māori and provided protection, instruction and support. Although Hadfield disliked the excessive filth and noise, he wrote to his family that he never felt happier or more contented and composed in his life. Touring his vast parish, he found the Māori he encountered a most pleasing, interesting, intelligent set of people. In Queen Charlotte Sound, the kindness and attention of Te Ateawa, who built him a comfortable house, delighted my soul. Although he left mother, father, brothers, sisters in England, he wrote home, I found them here. Similarly, Selwyn disliked condescending talk about Māori and Pacifica as poor heathen and perishing savages. To go among the heathen as an equal and a brother, he considered far more profitable than to risk that subtle kind of self-righteousness which creeps into mission work, akin to thanking God that we are not as other men are. Alarmed by claims from New Zealand company supporters that Māori rights and welfare needed no consideration because the race was doomed to extinction, Selwyn wrote to his old friend William Gladstone that he hoped to take care that none of those damnable crimes by which the coloured races of other lands have melted away before that pest which he calls civilisation shall be cloaked under the name of a decree of providence or an inevitable law of nature. During the 1840s, Selwyn and Hadfield were prominent in what was, in some ways, a de facto Anglican establishment. All the early governors were Anglican. They regularly consulted missionaries, mostly Anglican, on Māori matters. The missionaries mediated between the state and Māori communities, often mihinare. Entanglement in Māori worlds facilitated Hadfield's and Selwyn's interventions in racial politics. In 1844, Hadfield told Governor Fitzroy's inquiry into the Waikato affray that Te Rauparaha and Ngāti Toa could not have been looking to fight the settlers because they brought women and children with them. In 1846, the Secretary of State for Colonies, Earl Grey, wrote to Governor George Grey recommending the introduction of a new constitution granting settler self-government and claiming the right to take over and sell wastelands not actually settled or cultivated by Māori. Believing that the church must act as the conscience of the state, Selwyn and senior Methodist missionaries protested that these proposals breached the treaty and betrayed Māori and missionaries alike. Selwyn promised to use all constitutional and legal measures in his power to inform the natives of their rights and privileges of British subjects and to assist them in asserting and maintaining them. He spoke out because he believed that his church had incurred serious political responsibility when its missionaries urged Māori to sign the treaty. He also knew that Christian chiefs would make up their own minds about British behaviour and wouldn't tolerate the government seizing their lands. A violent backlash would hurt everyone, not least the Church of England. These interventions in racial politics intensified settler hostility that had been simmering since the late 1830s. Leaders of the early company settlements often brought with them anti-clericalism well-rooted in English gentry culture. Many English settlers believed that just as the state should exercise authority over the church in the nation, so the squire should dominate the parson in the localities. This tradition flourished in the early colony. Governor Fitzroy's sympathy for missionaries, Māori, and of course his volatile temperament, annoyed many. When his Waikato inquiry held the Nelson settlers ultimately responsible, thanks partly to Hadfield's testimony, Nelson leader Alfred de Met, a lawyer, politician and poet who considered Christianity superstition and never went to church, attacked Fitzroy as a missionary-dominated Māori lover whose despotism trampled on the rights and privileges of freeborn Englishmen. Settlers at Wellington and Nelson burned Fitzroy in effigy when he left in 1845. In the mid-1850s, Hadfield set out to empower Māori by enrolling Māori voters. The provincial superintendent, Isaac Featherston, an Anglican, warned Premier Stafford, also Anglican, that Hadfield intended to place the whole representation of this province in the hands of the natives, or rather, of certain missionaries. If Hadfield turned the dangerous weapon of Māori voters against them, the settlers would not hesitate to defeat this missionary move with disastrous consequences. In January 1860, Governor Brown bought the flat and fertile Waitara block offered for sale the previous year. Senior Te Atiawa Chief Wirumukingi Te Rangatake opposed the sale. Previous governors, following mission advice, had respected the right of chiefs to do so. Not this time. Surveyors marched in, and in mid-March, government troops fired on Kingi's Pa at Te Kohia. In April, Bishop Selwyn wrote to the government respectfully protesting its decision to declare martial law in Taranaki before Māori had taken arms. Te Atiawa had long been faithful and efficient allies of the government and among the most loyal and peaceable of the New Zealand tribes. Invoking Christian just war teaching, he insisted that the government should not have resorted to military force before exhausting the resources of civil power to resolve the dispute. Since Britain annexed these islands primarily for the protection of the New Zealanders, this primary object of colonisation must not be sacrificed for the aggrandisement of the English provinces. Hadfield, penned a series of open letters to the Duke of Newcastle, Secretary of State for Colonies. By attacking a great chief who'd always been loyal to Her Majesty's government, the governor committed an act of folly closely bordering on insanity. If the Colonial Office did nothing, a war of races might erupt, which he thought Māori would win. The governor and his advisors were trying to mislead the Colonial Office and the public that they were fighting to uphold the Queen's sovereignty and the supremacy of law against rebels, a claim Hadfield rejected as a flimsy and transparent ploy to rationalise illegal conduct. Some members of Selwyn's circle tried to tone Hadfield down. He refused. Hundreds of Christian Māori wrote letters and petitions, outnumbering Pākehā protesters. Almost 500 Mihinare from Ōtaki Waitangi urged the Queen to recall the governor. They'd lived for years under the peace-securing principles of religion and upheld her laws, yet Brown unwarrantably took their land and fired upon her loving subjects, who aimed not to trample on the law, but simply to keep their land. In Hawke's Bay, Renata Kawepo, Tamaki Hikarangi of Ngāti Kahungunu, pictured here, an Anglican missionary teacher, told a hui at the Pāwhakairo that when one member of the body of Christ suffers, all suffer. Kia te awa deserved support from Māori across the land. Governor Brown had committed abominable murder in Taranaki, and the Colonial Parliament, which Kawepo called the lick platter assembly of the governor, must offer no palliating words and excuses. He urged the Queen to remove this governor gun feeder, powder feeder, ball feeder, and send one instead offering runangas, quiet judgments, love and charity, and good works. By refusing to legitimise the Taranaki as a just war, Anglican leaders created a moral and religious crisis in colonial politics. Long-simmering tensions boiled over. Reconnecting New Zealand with the old world helps illuminate why. In the UK, Protestant dissenters, Catholics, secular liberals and freethinkers had been battling for decades to remove a range of civic disabilities that made non-Anglicans second-class citizens. The Constitutional Revolution of 1828 to 32 removed many, though not all, of these. To settler critics of Selwyn's Church Party in New Zealand, however, the sight of upper crust Anglican clergy trying to run the country, turn the clock back, and benefit themselves and their Māori pets was more than they could bear. Perhaps the most extreme critic of the Church Party and Māori was, don't have a photo, the free-thinking Auckland journalist Charles Southwell. Determined to smash the old Protestant establishment, he had launched Britain's first openly atheistic newspaper, The Oracle of Reason, in Bristol in 1830. Settling in Auckland in 1856, his Auckland Examiner repeatedly attacked missionaries, humanitarians and Māori, especially Christian Māori. In 1860, he urged settlers to present Kingi's head on a plate and urged the government to execute treason-hatching bishops for their high crime of justifying armed rebellion. His call for Selwyn's execution won modest popular support. In May 1860, the Auckland farmer politician Josiah Firth, Congregationalist son of a dissenting minister, congratulated Governor Brown on his manly policy in Taranaki at a monster meeting in front of the courthouse in Queen Street. Māori suffered no injustice from settlers always ready to see justice done to all, he claimed. The real villains were a group of clerical gentlemen led by Selwyn, who'd long shown more sympathy for one brown man than for 10 white ones. Sending damning reports to influential friends at home, they were trying to convince Britain to force the colony to pay for the war. Firth and his supporters, by contrast, of even less importance in England than here, had no MPs or right honourables to correspond with. Yet they, not these elite Anglicans, represented the people of New Zealand. And as freeborn Englishmen, they must speak out against clergy interfering in politics. The crowd, almost 1,000 strong, hissing and jeering whenever Selwyn's name was mentioned, greeted Firth's speech with loud and continual cheering. Later, fighting in the Waikato, Firth profited from the vast confiscations of Māori land forced through Parliament by his Auckland colleagues, Frederick Whitaker and Thomas Russell. He turned 60,000 acres of the Matamata Plains into a showpiece of modern agricultural technology, becoming known locally as the Duke of Matamata. Although senior Methodist missionaries supported Anglican leaders against Earl Grey's dispatch in 1846-47, by 1860 they stood squarely behind the government. C.W. Richmond became one of Governor Brown's closest advisors as Minister of Native Affairs 1858-61, overseeing the Waitara Purchase. A cultured Unitarian widely read in the latest science, philosophy and theology, he considered Orthodox Trinitarian Christians less than entirely rational, a view that Church Party protests evidently reinforced. In a memorandum circulating in Britain and New Zealand, Richmond claimed that philanthropists like Selwyn and Hadfield were notoriously prone to the disturbing influences of prejudice and passion. The irrepressible feeling evident in the bishop's protest letter showed how far he'd abandoned the calm and matured approach of the rational statesman. His constant bias in favour of Māori was causing hatred of race. If the interests of settlers must remain permanently subordinate to that of natives, as Selwyn and Hadfield were suggesting, a war of races is inevitable and the European apologists of Kingi would be responsible. Richmond portrayed Selwyn and Hadfield as Māori-loving religious fanatics inciting race war by trampling on settler hopes. If transplanted radicals and dissenters such as Southwell, Firth and Richmond led the attack on Selwyn's Church Party, influential Anglican politicians joined them. Frederick Whitaker, a lawyer, represented the laity in discussions that led to Selwyn's 1857 Anglican Constitution that enhanced the independence and authority of the laity and church government. As Attorney General in the pro-war Stafford ministry until 1861, Whitaker declared the Taranaki War just, politic and unavoidable, and charged Kingi with treason. A low church evangelical who embraced the Erastian idea that the church must submit to the state if they clashed, in September 1860, Whitaker condemned the virulent attack upon the governor and government launched by Bishops Selwyn and Abraham. Brimming with falsehood and misrepresentation, their protests were creating discontent, distrust and disaffection. By 1864, Whitaker, now Premier, and his legal partner Thomas Russell, Minister of Defence, used British soldiers and money to confiscate so much Māori land so indiscriminately that they alienated the Colonial Office, British military leaders including General Cameron and even Governor Grey. Many lay Anglicans felt like Whitaker. What's interesting about, many people will have seen that, the Bible, now the point is, Selwyn is calling this one a savage. And you can't see it, but the words on the Bible he's holding up are home influence. Selwyn's mobilising his hoity-toity establishment mates in really seriously unpatriotic ways. And here he is. This is what's wrong. The church, symbolised by Selwyn, is dictating to the state, Governor Brown. And you see who's inspiring Selwyn in the view of Taranaki Punch. This is all my favourite. Taranaki Punch, the game of the war, and there's the Māori king, there's Kuini Wikitoria, but there's a couple of anomalous pieces. This one, whose side is Selwyn on? He's got puffy white sleeves, but he's mostly black, but there's an even more black and dastardly character. There is Archdeacon Hadfield, and he is menacing Kuini Wikitoria. Conclusion. The colonial state that emerged during the wars was dominated by politicians who decided what kind of religiously grounded racial politics they would tolerate and what kind they would reject. A critical mass of Anglican, dissenting, and liberal politicians cast beyond the pale fanatical Anglican clergy and missionaries who, they said, favoured Māori, undermined good government and betrayed their fellow Britons. In 2001, Lindsay Head argued that most Māori leaders pursued modernity by making Christianity, peace and law their own. Yet many historians, apart from Michael Belgrave and Monty Sutar, haven't taken Head's arguments particularly seriously. Well, histories of nations are built on forgetting as well as remembering. Perhaps the idea that our nation state was born during the wars by elbowing aside not just Pākehā Anglican leaders, but a much larger number of Māori Christians of all varieties is one we'd rather forget. Thank you.